Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Overtime Sports. In today's video, I will be listing my predictions on every single NFL team. So, I know that the Detroit Lions versus Kansas City Chiefs game has, just happened this past Thursday. So, but I wrote these predictions, September, the week before. I wanted to get the video out before that game, but that just didn't happen, so better late than never. So, without further ado, let's get started. We're going to start off in the NFC West. Alright, up first we have the Arizona Cardinals. So, week 1, they go to FedEx Field to play the Washington Commanders. I think the Commanders are going to win that one. Up next, week 2, their home opener against the New York Giants. I think they'll lose that one too. Week 3 versus the Cowboys at home. That's probably a loss. Week 4 at San Francisco. You better bet you that's a fourth loss in a row. Week 5 versus Cincinnati at home. Joe Burrow. I don't have to say anything. That's definitely a Cardinals lose. Week 6 at the Los Angeles Rams. That is where I think they get their first win. Week 7 at the Seattle Seahawks Stadium. I think that's also going to be a win. Week 8, they return home to face the Baltimore Ravens. I think that is a loss there. Week 9 at Cleveland. I think that's a W. Week 10 versus Atlanta, that's probably a W. And Week 11 at Houston, that is a W on my chart. Week 12 versus the Los Angeles Rams, I actually have them losing that. Week 13 against Pittsburgh, I have them winning that, or the Cardinals winning. And then Week 14 is their bye. Week 15 versus San Francisco, I think that'll be a loss. Week 16 at the Chicago Bears Stadium, Soldier Field. I honestly think that's going to be a win. Week 17 at the Philadelphia Eagles. That's going to be a loss there. And then Week 18 versus Seattle. That will be a win. And so I have their final record at 8-9. And up next we have the Los Angeles Rams. So let's get into it. Week 1, they play at Seattle. I think that's going to be a win. Week 2, they go to their home opener at versus San Francisco. I think that's going to be a loss there. Week 3 at Cincinnati. That's probably going to be a loss. Week 4 at the Colts. I think that's going to be a win. Week 5 versus the Philadelphia Eagles. That's probably going to be a loss there. Week 6 versus Arizona. That's going to be a win. Week 7 versus Pittsburgh. I think that's going to be a loss. Week 8 at the Dallas Cowboys. I think that's also going to be a loss. Week 9 at the Green Bay Packers. I think that will be a win for them. Week 11 at versus Seattle, that will be a win for the Rams. Week 12 at the Arizona Cardinals. I think Arizona is going to win that one, so loss for the Rams. Then Week 13, they go up against Cleveland. Also, their bye was Week 10, by the way. So, Week 13 versus Cleveland, I think that will be a loss. Week 14 at the Baltimore Ravens, I also think that will be a loss. Week 15 versus the Washington Commanders, I think that'll be a win. Week 16 versus the New Orleans Saints, that will be a win for the Rams. And then Week 17 at the New York Giants, I think that will be a loss. And then Week 18 at the San Francisco 49ers, I think that'll be a loss. So that will put their final record at 7 wins, 10 losses. Up next, we have the Seattle Seahawks. So let's jump right into it. Week 1, their home opener versus the Los Angeles Rams. That will be a loss there. Week 2 at Detroit. I think that's going to be a loss. Week 3 versus Carolina. That'll be a win. Week 4 at the New York Giants. I think that'll be a win for the Seahawks. Then week 5 is their bye. Week 6, they go to Cincinnati to take on the Bengals. I think that'll be a loss. Week 7 versus Arizona. I think that'll be a win. Week 8 versus Cleveland. That's probably going to be a loss right there. Week 9 at Baltimore. I think Baltimore is going to be pretty good this season, so I say they'll lose to Baltimore there. Week 10 versus the Washington Commanders. I think that'll be a win for the Seahawks. Week 11 at the Rams. That'll be a loss. Week 12 versus the San Francisco 49ers. I have that a loss. Week 13 at the Dallas Cowboys. I have that a loss. Week 14 at the 49ers. That's going to be a loss. Week 15 versus Philadelphia. That will be a loss there. And Week 16 at Tennessee Titans. That will be a win there. Week 17 versus Philadelphia. Pittsburgh. That will be a win for Seattle. And then Week 18, I think they'll lose to Arizona. So that would put their final score at 6 wins, 11 losses. Alright, and up next we have the San Francisco 49ers. Week 1, they played Pittsburgh. I think that'll be a win for San Francisco. Week 2 at the Los Angeles Rams. That'll be a win. Week 3 versus the New York Giants. That'll be a win. Week 4 versus the Arizona Cardinals. I say that's a win. Week 5 versus the Dallas Cowboys. That'll be a win. Week 6 at Cleveland. I think that'll be a win. Week 7 at Minnesota. That will be a win. And then finally, Week 8 versus Cincinnati. I say that'll be a loss. Then Week 10 at Jacksonville. I say that'll be a loss. Week 11 that's a win. And Week 11 versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I say that'll be a win. Week 12 at Seattle, I say that'll be a win. Week 13 at Philadelphia, I think Philadelphia's going to win again in that NFC Championship 2023 rematch. I have Philadelphia winning that one. Week 14 versus Seattle, I have them winning. Week 15 at Arizona, I have them winning. And at Week 16 versus Baltimore, I have them losing there. Week 17 at the Washington Commanders, that's going to be a win. Week 18 versus Rams. I'm sorry, Rams fans. That's a win for your 49ers. That's the 49ers predictions, and that's it for the NFC West. Alright, and so let's head up north to the NFC North. So we'll start off with the Chicago Bears. Here we go. Week 1 versus the Green Bay Packers. Even with the new QB in Jordan Love, I still think the Bears will lose that. Week 2 versus at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think that'll be a loss. Week 3 at Kansas City. That will be a loss. Week 4 versus Denver. I'm going to say that's a win. Week 5 at the Washington Commanders. That will be a win. Week 6 versus Minnesota. I think that will be a loss. Week 7 versus the Raiders. I think that'll be a loss. Week 8 at the Los Angeles Chargers. That'll be a win. Week 9 at the New Orleans Saints. I think that'll be a loss. Week 10 versus the Carolina Panthers, I say that'll be a win. Week 11 at Detroit, I say that's a loss. Week 12 at Minnesota, loss. Then Week 13 is their bye week. get back into the groove of things. Week 14 versus Detroit. They're going to win that. Week 15 at Cleveland. They're going to win that. Week 16 versus Arizona. They're going to win that. Week 17 versus Atlanta. They're going to win that. But then Week 18 at Lambeau Field, they'll lose to the Packers. So that will bring a final score of 8-9 to the Chicago Bears. Better than they did last season. Alright, up next we got the Detroit Lions. Week 1 at Kansas City. Everybody, had Kansas City winning that game. I actually had Detroit winning that game. So, I'm really happy that Detroit won, and my predictions are so far 100% correct. Alright, Week 2 versus Seattle, that'll be a win. Week 3 versus Atlanta, that's a win. Week 4 at Green Bay, that'll be a loss. Week 5 versus Carolina, that'll be a win. Week 6 at Tampa Bay, that'll be a loss. Week 7 at Baltimore, that'll be a loss. Week 8 versus Las Vegas, that'll be a loss. Week 9's their bye. Week 10 at the Los Angeles Chargers, that'll be a win. Week 11 versus the Chicago Bears, win. Week 12 versus the Green Bay Packers, win. Week 13 at the New Orleans Saints, win. Week 14 at Chicago, that'll be a loss. Then Week 15 versus Denver, win. Week 16 at Minnesota, win. Week 17 at Dallas, loss. Week 18 versus Minnesota, that'll be a loss. 10-7's their final score. And up next, we have the Green Bay Packers. So, Week 1 at Chicago, that's a win. Week 2 at Atlanta, that's a win. Week 3, home opener versus New Orleans, I say that's a loss. Week 4 versus Detroit, loss. Week 5 at Las Vegas, loss. Then Week 6 is their bye. Week 7 at Denver, win. Week 8 versus Minnesota, win. Week 9 versus Los Angeles Rams, that's going to be a win. Week 10 at Pittsburgh, I say that's a loss. Week 11 versus the Chargers, that's a win. Week 12 at Detroit, loss. Week 3 versus Kansas City, that's a loss. Week 14 at the New York Giants, win. Week 15 versus Tampa Bay, win. Week 16 at Carolina, win. Week 17 at Minnesota, win. And now they're in the same place they were last season. 8-8. They have to play Week 18. They have to win Week 18 to get a chance to get at least a tiny little chance into the playoffs. And their last game's against Chicago. So, of course, that's a win. So, they end up on the positive side of things. 9-8 this year instead of 8-9 last season. I have good hope in Jordan Love this season. Up next, we have the NFC North champions of last year, the Minnesota Vikings. Lightning round here. Week 1 versus Tampa Bay, win. Week 2 at Philly, win. Or loss, sorry. Week 3 versus Chargers, win. Week 4 at Carolina, win. Week 5 versus Kansas City, loss. Week 6 at Chicago, win. Week 7 versus San Francisco, loss. Week 8 at Green Bay, win. Week 9 at Atlanta, win. Week 10 versus New Orleans, loss. Week 11 at Denver, win. Week 12 versus Chicago, win. Week 13 is their bye. Week 14 at Las Vegas, win. Week 15 at Cincinnati, loss. Week 16 versus Detroit, loss. Week 17 versus Green Bay, win. Week 18 at Detroit, win. Final score, 11-6. Also, really enjoyed quarterback, but I'm being honest here. No quarterback things aside, even though I do kind of like Kirk Cousins a little more, but still, I gave my honest opinion on this. Trust me. And next we move on to the NFC East. And we start off with the Dallas Cowboys. So, week 1 at the New York Giants, loss. Week 2 versus the Jets, win. Week 3 at Arizona, win. Week 4 versus Patriots, win. Week 5 at San Francisco, loss. Week 6 at the Chargers, loss. Week 7's their bye. Week 8 versus the Rams, win. Week 9 at Philadelphia, loss. Week 10 versus New York Giants, loss. Week 11 at Carolina, win. Week 12 versus Washington, win. Week 13 versus Seattle, win. Week 14 versus Philadelphia, loss. Week 15 at Buffalo, loss. Week 16 at Miami, loss. Week 17 versus Detroit, win. Week 18 at Washington, win. Final score, 9-8. Up next, the New York Giants. Week 1 versus Dallas, win. Week 2 at Arizona, win. Week 3 at San Francisco, loss. Week 4 versus Seattle, win. Week 5 at Miami, loss. Week 6 at Buffalo, loss. Week 7 versus Washington, win. Week 8 versus the New York Jets, loss. Week 9 at Las Vegas, loss. Week 10 at Dallas, win. Week 11 at Washington, win. Week 12 versus New England, win. Week 13's their bye. Week 14 versus Green Bay, loss. Week 15 at New Orleans, loss. Week 16 at Philadelphia, loss. Week 17 versus the Los Angeles Rams, win. Week 18 versus Philadelphia, loss. Final record, 8-9. Up next, we have the Philadelphia Eagles. Week 1 at New England, win. Week 2 versus Minnesota, win. Week 3 at Tampa, win. Week 4 versus Washington, win. Week 5 at the Los Angeles Rams, win. Week 6 at New York Jets, loss. Week 7 versus Miami, loss. Week 8 at Washington, win. Week 9 versus Dallas, loss. Week 10's their bye. Week 11 at Kansas City, win. Week 12 versus Buffalo, loss. Week 13 versus San Francisco, loss. Week 14 at Dallas, loss. Week 15 at Seattle, win. Week 16 versus New York Giants, win. Week 17 versus the Cardinals, win. Week 18 versus the New York Giants, win. Final score, 11-6. Up next, we have the Washington Commanders. Week 1 versus Arizona, win. Week 2 at Denver, win. Week 3 versus Buffalo, loss. Week 4 at Philadelphia, loss. Week 5 versus Chicago, loss. Week 6 at Atlanta, win. Week 7 at the New York Giants, loss. Week 8 versus Philadelphia, loss. Week 9 at New England, win. Week 10 at Seattle, win. Week 11 versus New York Giants, loss. Week 12 at Dallas Cowboys, loss. Week 13 versus Miami Dolphins, win. Week 14's their bye. Week 15, Rams, loss. Week 16, New York Jets, loss. Week 17 versus San Francisco, loss. Week 18 versus Dallas, loss. Final score, 6-11. Up next is the Atlanta Falcons. Week 1 versus Carolina, win. Week 2 versus Green Bay, loss. Week 3 at Detroit, loss. Week 4 at Jacksonville, you better believe that's a loss. Week 5 versus Houston, that's where they win. Week 6 versus Washington, loss. Week 7 at Tampa Bay, loss. Week 8 at Tennessee, win. Week 9 versus Minnesota, loss. Week 10 at Arizona, win. Week 11, bye. Week 12 versus New Orleans, loss. Week 13 at New York Jets, loss. Week 14 versus Tampa Bay, win. Week 15 at Carolina, win. Week 16 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 17 at Chicago, win. Week 18 at New Orleans, loss. Final score, 8-9. Up next is the Carolina Panthers. Week 1 at Atlanta, loss. Week 2 versus New Orleans, loss. Week 3 at Seattle, win. Week 4 versus Minnesota, loss. Week 5 at Detroit, loss. Week 6 at Miami, loss. Week 7's their bye. Week 8 versus Houston, win. Week 9 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 10 versus at Chicago, win. Week 11 versus Dallas, loss. Week 12 at Tennessee, win. Week 13 at Tampa Bay, loss. Week 14 at New Orleans, loss. Week 15 versus Atlanta, loss. Week 16 versus Green Bay, loss. Week 17 at Jacksonville, loss. Week 18 versus Tampa Bay, loss. Final record, 5 wins, 12 losses. Up next, we have the New Orleans Saints. Week 1 versus Tennessee, win. Week 2 at Carolina, win. Week 3 at Green Bay, loss. Week 4 versus Tampa Bay, win. Week 5 at New England, win. Week 6 at Houston, win. Week 7 at versus Jacksonville, loss. Week 8 at Indianapolis, win. Week 9 versus Chicago, win. Week 10 at Minnesota, loss. Week 11, bye. Week 12 at Atlanta, win. Week 13 versus Detroit, loss. Week 14 versus Carolina, win. Week 15 versus the Giants, win. Week 16 at Carolina, win. Week 17 at Tampa Bay, loss. Week 18 versus Atlanta, win. Final score, 12-5. And then lastly, for the entirety of the NFC, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Week 1 at Minnesota, loss. Week 2 versus Chicago, win. Week 3 versus Philadelphia, loss. Week 4 at New Orleans, loss. Week 5's their bye. Week 6 versus Detroit, loss. Week 7 versus Atlanta, loss. Week 8 at Buffalo, loss. Week 9 at Houston, win. Week 10 versus Tennessee, win. Week 11 at San Francisco, loss. Week 12 at Indianapolis, win. Week 13 versus Carolina, win. Week 14 at Atlanta, win. Week 15 at Green Bay, loss. Week 16 versus Jacksonville, loss. Week 17 versus New Orleans, loss. Week 18 at Carolina, win. Final score, 7-10. That wraps it up for the NFC. And up next, we have the Denver Broncos. Week 1 versus Las Vegas, loss. Week 2 versus Washington, win. Week 3 at Miami, loss. Week 4 at Chicago, win. Week 5 versus the Jets, loss. Week 6 at Kansas City, loss. Week 7 versus Green Bay, win. Week 8 versus Kansas City, loss. Week 9's their bye. Week 10 at Buffalo, loss. Week 11 at Minnesota, loss. Week 12 versus Cleveland, win. Week 13 at Houston, win. Week 14 at Los Angeles Chargers, win. Week 15 at Detroit, loss. Week 16 versus New England, win. Week 17 versus Los Angeles, win. Week 18 at Las Vegas, loss. Final record, 7-10. And up next, we have the defending Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. So, Week 1 versus Detroit, loss. Week 2 at Jacksonville, loss. Week 3 versus Chicago, win. Week 4 at New York, loss. Week 5 at Minnesota, win. Week 6 versus Denver, win. Week 7 versus Los Angeles, win. Week 8 at Denver, win. Week 9 versus Miami, loss. Week 10 is their bye. Week 11 versus Philadelphia, loss. Week 12 at Las Vegas, win. Week 13 at Green Bay, win. Week 14 versus Buffalo, loss. Week 15 at New England, win. Week 16 versus Las Vegas, loss. Week 17 versus Cincinnati, loss. Week 18 at Los Angeles Chargers, win. Final record, 9-8. Up next, we have the Las Vegas Raiders. Week 1 at Denver, win. Week 2 at Buffalo, loss. Week 3 versus Pittsburgh, win. Week 4 at Los Angeles, win. Week 5 versus Green Bay, win. Week 6 versus New England, win. Week 7 at Chicago, win. Week 8 at Detroit, loss. Week 9 versus New York Giants, win. Week 10 versus New York Jets, loss. Week 11 at Miami, loss. Week 12 versus Kansas City, loss. Week 13 is their bye. Week 14 versus Minnesota, loss. Week 15 versus Los Angeles Chargers, win. Week 16 at Kansas City, win. Week 17 at Indianapolis, win. Week 18 versus Denver, win. Final record, 11-6. Up next, we have the Los Angeles Chargers. Week 1 versus Miami, loss. Week 2 at Tennessee, loss. Week 3 at Minnesota, loss. Week 4 versus Las Vegas, loss. Week 5 is their bye. Week 6 versus Dallas, loss. Week 7 at Kansas City, loss. Week 8 versus Chicago, win. Week 9 at New York Jets. That's going to be a brutal game. Win for the Chargers. Week 10 versus Detroit, loss. Week 11 at Green Bay, win. Week 12 versus Baltimore, loss. Week 13 at New England, win. Week 14 versus Denver, win. Week 15 at Las Vegas, loss. Week 16 versus Buffalo, loss. Week 17 at Denver, loss. Week 18 versus Kansas City, loss. Final record, 5-12. And up next we have the AFC North, starting off with the Baltimore Ravens. Week 1 versus Houston, win. Week 2 at Cincinnati, win. Week 3 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 4 at Cleveland, loss. Week 5 at Pittsburgh, loss. Week 6 at Tennessee, win. Week 7 versus Detroit, win. Week 8 at Arizona, win. Week 9 versus Seattle, loss. Week 10 versus Cleveland, win. Week 11 versus Cincinnati, win. Week 12 at Los Angeles Chargers, loss. Week 13 is their bye. Week 14 versus the Los Angeles Rams, win. Week 15 at Jacksonville, loss. Week 16 at San Francisco, loss. Week 17 versus Miami, loss. Week 18 versus Pittsburgh, win. Final score, 10-7. Up next, we have the Cincinnati Bengals. Week 1 at Cleveland, win. Week 2 versus Baltimore, loss. Week 3 versus Los Angeles Rams, win. Week 4 at Tennessee, win. Week 5 at Arizona, win. Week 6 versus Seattle, win. Week 7's their bye. Week 8 at San Francisco, loss. Week 9 versus Buffalo, loss. Week 10 versus Houston, win. Week 11 at Baltimore, loss. Week 12 versus Pittsburgh, win. Week 13 at Jacksonville, loss. Week 14 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 15 versus Minnesota, win. Week 16 at Pittsburgh, win. Week 17 at Kansas City, win. Week 18 versus Cleveland, win. Final record, 12-5. Up next is the Cleveland Browns. Week 1 versus Cincinnati, loss. Week 2 at Pittsburgh, win. Week 3 versus Tennessee, loss. Week 4 versus Baltimore, loss. Week 5's their bye. Week 6 versus San Francisco, loss. Week 7 at Indianapolis, loss. Week 8 at Seattle, loss. Or win, sorry. Week 9 versus Arizona, win. Week 10 at Baltimore, win. Week 11 versus Pittsburgh, loss. Week 12 at Denver, win. Week 13 at Los Angeles Rams, win. Week 14 at Jacksonville, win. That will be a brutal game, ladies and gentlemen. Week 15 versus Chicago, loss. Week 16 at Houston, loss. Week 17 versus New York Jets, loss. Week 18 versus Cincinnati, or at Cincinnati, you better believe that's a loss. Final record, 7-10. Up next, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers. Week 1 versus San Francisco, loss. Week 2 versus Cleveland, loss. Week 3 at Las Vegas, loss. Week 4 at Houston, win. Week 5 versus Baltimore, loss. Week 6 is their bye. Week 7 at Los Angeles Rams, win. Week 8 versus Jacksonville, loss. Week 9 versus Tennessee, win. Week 10 versus Green Bay, win. Week 11 at Cleveland, win. Week 12 at Cincinnati, win. Week 3 versus Arizona, win. Week 14 versus New England, win. Week 15 at Indianapolis, win. Or loss, sorry. Week 16 versus Cincinnati, loss. Week 17 at Seattle, win. Week 18 at Baltimore, win. Final record, 10-7. And now we head on over to the AFC East, where I will be talking about the Bills now. Alright, Week 1 at New York Jets, win. Week 2 versus Las Vegas, win. Week 3 at Washington, win. Week 4 versus Miami, win. Week 5 versus Jacksonville, loss. Week 16 versus New York Giants, loss. Week 7 at New England, win. Week 8 versus Tampa Bay, win. Week 9 at Cincinnati, win. Week 10 versus Denver, win. Week 11 versus New York Jets, lose. Week 12 at Philadelphia, loss. Week 13 is their bye. Week 14 at Kansas City, win. Week 15 versus Dallas, win. Week 16 at Los Angeles, win. Week 17 versus New England, win. Week 18 at Miami, win. Final record, 13-4. And up next, we have the Miami Dolphins. Week 1 at Los Angeles, win. Week 2 at New England, win. Week 3 versus Denver, win. Week 4 at Buffalo, loss. Week 5 versus New York, loss. Week 6 versus Carolina, win. Week 7 at Philadelphia, loss. Week 8 versus New England, win. Week 9 at Kansas City, loss. Week 10 is their bye. Week 11 versus Las Vegas, loss. Week 12 at New York Jets, loss. Week 13 at Washington, win. Week 14 versus Tennessee, win. Week 15 versus New York Jets, loss. Week 16 versus Dallas, loss. Week 17 at Baltimore, loss. Week 18 versus Buffalo, loss. Final record, 7-10. And up next, we have the New England Patriots. Week 1 versus Philadelphia, loss. Week 2 versus Miami, loss. Week 3 at New York Jets, loss. Week 4 at Dallas, loss. Week 5 versus New Orleans, loss. Week 6 at Las Vegas, loss. Week 7 versus Buffalo, loss. Week 8 at Miami, win. Week 9 versus Washington, win. Week 10 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 11's their bye. Week 12 at New York Giants, win. Week 12 versus Los Angeles Chargers, win. Week 14 at Pittsburgh Steelers, win. Week 15 versus Kansas City, loss. Week 16 at Denver, win. Week 17 at Buffalo, loss. Week 18 versus New York Jets, loss. Final record, 8-9. And up next, we've got the New York Jets. Week 1 versus Buffalo, loss. Week 2 at Dallas, loss. Week 3 versus New England, win. Week 4 versus Kansas City, win. Week 5 at Denver, win. Week 6 versus Philadelphia, loss. Week 7's their bye. Week 8 at New York Giants, win. Week 9 versus Los Angeles Chargers, win. Week 10 at Las Vegas, win. Week 11 at Buffalo, win. Week 12 versus Miami, loss. Week 13 versus Atlanta, win. Week 14 versus Houston, win. Week 15 at Miami, loss. Week 16 versus Washington, win. Week 17 at Cleveland, loss. Week 18 at New England, win. Final record, 10-7. Up next, we've got the Houston Texans. Week 1 at Baltimore, loss. Week 2 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 3 at Jacksonville, loss. Week 4 versus Pittsburgh, win. Week 5 at Atlanta, win. Week 6 versus New Orleans, win. Week 7's their bye. Week 8 at Carolina, win. Week 9 versus Tampa, win. Week 10 at Cincinnati, loss. Week 11 versus Arizona, loss. Week 12 versus Jacksonville, loss. Week 13 versus Denver, win. Week 14 at New York Jets, loss. Week 15 at Tennessee, loss. Week 16 versus Cleveland, loss. Week 17 versus Tennessee, win. Week 18 at Indianapolis, win. Final record, 9-8. Up next, we have the Indianapolis Colts. Week 1 versus Jacksonville, loss. Week 2 at Houston, loss. Week 3 at Baltimore, loss. Week 4 versus Los Angeles Rams, win. Week 5 at versus Tennessee, win. Week 6 at Jacksonville, loss. Week 7 versus Cleveland, loss. Week 8 versus New Orleans, win. Week 9 at Carolina, win. Week 10 at New England, win. Week 11's their bye. Week 12 versus Tampa Bay, loss. Week 13 at Tennessee, win. Week 14 at Cincinnati, loss. Week 15 at Pittsburgh, win. Versus Pittsburgh, win. Week 16 at Atlanta, win. Week 17 versus Las Vegas, loss. Week 18 versus Houston, loss. Final record, 8-9. Up next, we got the Jacksonville Jaguars. Week 1 at Indianapolis, win. Week 2 versus Kansas City, win. Week 3 versus Houston, win. Week 4 versus Atlanta, win. Week 5 at Buffalo, loss. Week 6 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 7 at New Orleans, loss. Week 8 at Pittsburgh, win. Week 9 is their bye. Week 10 versus San Francisco, loss. Week 11 versus Tennessee, win. Week 12 at Houston, win. Week 13 versus Cincinnati, loss. Week 14 at Cleveland, loss. Week 15 versus Baltimore, loss. Week 16 at Tampa Bay, win. Week 17 at versus Carolina, win. Week 18 at Tennessee, win. Final record, 10-6. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, we have the Tennessee Titans. Week 1 at New Orleans, loss. Week 2 versus Los Angeles Chargers, loss. Week 3 at Cleveland, loss. Week 4 versus Cincinnati, loss. Week 5 at Indianapolis, win. Week 6 versus Baltimore, loss. Week 7's their bye. Week 8 versus Atlanta, win. Week 9 at Pittsburgh, win. Week 10 at Tampa Bay, win. Week 11 at Jacksonville, loss. Week 12 versus Carolina, win. Week 13 versus Indianapolis, win. Week 14 at Miami, loss. Week 15 versus Houston, loss. Week 16 versus Seattle, win. Week 17 at Houston, win. Week 17 versus Week 18 versus Jacksonville, loss. Final record 8-9. And so that has been my 2023 to 2024 predictions video. Thank you all for watching, and please subscribe as it will help out the channel a lot. And we'll see you guys next time on Overtime Sports.